Hey there guys, and welcome back to Let's Play Pokémon FireRed. I'm your host, PhazonFlux, and in the last episode, we advanced through Pewter City, got a gift from Mom, and pretty much completed Route 3. Because the only other thing left on it is a Pokémon Center for resting up. And why would you need to rest up at the end of a route when you can just walk back to Pewter? Well, to save time when you have to come back to heal for our second dungeon, Mount Moon. But before we begin that, let's take a look at what this Pokemon Center has to offer. And by that, I mean there's actually a unique character. There's this guy in the corner here who will sell us a Pokemon, a Magikarp, for 500 Pokédollars. Now it's kind of interesting that you can actually buy it, but overall it's not worth it because you can get Magikarps much later in the game free. And this guy here is reading a newspaper apparently. Team Rocket attacks Cerulean citizens. Not a day goes by without Team Rocket being in the news. Now if I'm not mistaken, that's the first we've heard of these guys. They certainly don't sound nice. But without further ado, let us begin our second dungeon. Now before we hop in there, I will note that it's actually kind of long, especially compared to Viridian Forest, because this place has 3 floors. And each floor has a slightly different encounter rate for Pokemon, so I'll go ahead and start explaining that. The most common Pokemon you will find here is Zubat, at a whopping 69%. These Pokemon are pretty good if you don't already have a flying or a poison type Pokemon for your team, because they've got a decent attack stat, they're very fast. However, one major letdown to them is they don't have a good move pool, and you can't even access its final evolution until post-game. Until after you beat the Elite Four, you can't even evolve it to its fullest, to its fullest stage. So that kind of hurts its playability a little bit. Moving on, we have Geodude at 25%. You've seen Brock use these, so you should kind of know what to expect. They're a rock ground type Pokemon, and they've got a really good defense and a decent attack stat. The only problem with them is their typing. They have a lot of weaknesses, which means even with that crazy high defense, they're not going to be standing up to too many of their foes. There's also much better rock and ground type Pokemon later on in the game, so I would pass on Geodude as well. Also, just like with Zubat, its final evolution is kind of a pain to obtain. You have to do a trait evolution, and since I'm running an emulator, I can't really do that so well. It's possible, but it's really annoying to try and do, so I'm just not going to deal with it. Moving on, what's more, we have Paris at 5%. Now, I would not recommend picking up Paris here on the first floor of Mount Moon, because the second floor, it has a 100% chance of obtaining them. So that's where I would catch it. Paris is also not a very good Pokemon. It's got one outstanding feature about it, and that's the move Spore. It's a 100% accuracy sleep move. So it's useful for that sense, but its stats and the rest of its move pool aren't too great. Plus its typing is arguably one of the worst in the game because it has a lot of weaknesses. The last Pokemon you can get here in Mount Moon is Clefairy, at a 1% chance on the first floor. Now, like Jigglypuff, it's not that great in battle. It can use Sing, and it has an interesting move, Metronome, which basically makes it so that it'll use any random move in the entire game. So it's fun to use, but not necessarily good. So I would pass on using Clefairy as well. But if you're completing your Pokedex, this is where you have to go to get it. Again, I would not catch Clefairy here on the first floor, as the very bottom floor of Mount Moon has a slightly higher encounter rate for Clefairy. So, if you'll notice, I've changed up how I shared video of the wild Pokemon here. Instead of just cutting away, I felt that was a little too choppy, so I decided to just kind of show little clips instead. So, I hope you guys like the changes, and I'm just going to go ahead and cut out the rest of the wild Pokemon you can get here, as I've already explained it. Now this interesting trainer here says suspicious men are in the cave. What about you? So that's a little hint of some stuff that we might encounter a little bit later on. Now, I'm also thinking of speeding up and playing music to Mount Moon here, as I've already done a failed recording through Mount Moon here, and it was taking way too long leaving the trainers in and just talking. So I think I'm just gonna, again, keep cutting out wild battles and just speed up everything else, all the trainers. So, I will also point out some interesting stuff from time to time, and I will continue to show you where to get items and all that stuff. But, for the most part, I'll be speeding up. So, whatever I decide to put here, cue the music. An interesting thing to note about Mount Moon, though, is in a lot of dungeons in video games, you want to be a little hesitant as to which path you take if there's multiple branches in a path. In other words, if the dungeon isn't completely linear and you have multiple ways to go, normally you're pretty cautious about where to go. However, since Mount Moon is just the second dungeon of this game, they make it pretty simple. They give you the option of taking various pathways. However, whenever you see a ladder that advances you further into the cave, just go ahead and do it. Alright guys, I cut out a little bit of off-screen healing, and we're just going to continue down into the second basement floor. And what is this? We, Team Rocket, are Pokemon gangsters. We strike fear with our strength. Alright, so here's our first encounter with Team Rocket. They're the guys that we've been hearing so much about. They've apparently been destroying Cerulean City, so let's put a stop to it. If they're here in Mount Moon, it can't be good either. Although if you think about it, the thought of literally gangsters in a dark cave, and I'm just a 10-year-old, that's kind of frightening. Granted, I do have my Pokemon with me, but still. It's a good thing you just can't take video games seriously, because if you did, you'd realize just how ridiculous a lot of them are. Oh well, I guess if video games were really just realistic, then that would take the fun out of it. Because what's the point of playing a video game if it's like real life? Just do real life stuff. Actually have real experiences. That's the problem I think a lot of newer video games are having. They're just too realistic. I feel like Pokemon cities in like Gen 6, like, what's it called, Lumio City in Pokemon X and Y? That city was way too big. It didn't need to be like that. Even Castelia City in Gen 5, I would argue that was too big. And just a bunch of other video games, like in the Tales series. A lot of the newer Tales games have really huge cities, and I don't think there's any need for that. I mean, it's really cool, don't get me wrong, but at the same time, it just takes up a lot of time. Anyways, continuing on in Mount Moon, back to the speed up. Kamek! guys, well, we're about done with Mount Moon. We've got the final floor to take care of. But we're about out of time, so we'll finish this up next time on Let's Play Pokemon FireRed. Thank you all so much for watching. Have a blessed day.